You know, I never thought I'd see the day when my own daughter would look me in the eye and say, "You'll either obey my husband or get out of my house." But that's exactly what happened on a Saturday afternoon in April, right there in the living room of the home I'd paid for with 43 years of hard work. I'm George Mitchell. I'm 72 years old. And instead of begging or arguing, I did something they never expected. I smiled, walked to my bedroom, grabbed my suitcase, and left. 1 week later, they had 28 missed calls on my phone. And that, my friends, was just the beginning of their regret. Let me back up and tell you how it started. It was a beautiful spring Saturday. The kind of day where the Montana sun filters through the curtains just right, warming everything it touches. I'd just come home from the grocery store, plastic bags cutting into my wrists like they always do when you try to carry too many at once. I'm talking milk, bread, steaks for dinner, and a 12-pack of Corona. That's right, Corona. Not the cheap stuff I drink. Expensive beer specifically for my son-in-law, Kyle. I pushed through the front door. And there he was. Kyle Dawson. 32 years old, sprawled out in my leather recliner like he owned the place. Now, that chair wasn't just any chair. My wife Barbara, God rest her soul. She bought me that recliner for my 60th birthday. Saved up for 6 months from her part-time job at the library. Had my initials embossed on the headrest. GM George Mitchell. And there's Kyle. Stocking feet propped up, half-empty beer bottle dangling from his fingers, watching basketball like he didn't have a care in the world. He didn't even look at me. Just kept his eyes on that television screen and said, "Old man, grab me another beer from the fridge while you're up. Not could you please. Not would you mind." Just a command, like I was his servant. Now, I'd spent 30 years working at First Heritage Bank. I'd handled million-dollar accounts. I'd served 2 tours in Vietnam. And I'd raised a daughter by myself after cancer took my Barbara 5 years ago. But in that moment, standing in my own living room with grocery bags cutting into my 72-year-old wrists, my son-in-law thought he could order me around like hired help. I set those bags down slowly. Real slow. And I said, "Excuse me." That's when Kyle finally looked at me. His face had that expression I'd seen before. The one that said I was being difficult, unreasonable, too sensitive. He stood up, using every inch of his 6'2" frame to tower over me. "Your house," he said with a nasty little smile. "That's funny, George, because your daughter and I live here. We pay the bills. And as far as I'm concerned, if you want to keep living here peacefully, you'll do what I ask. Simple as that." That's when the kitchen door opened. My daughter Rebecca. We called her Becky growing up. 30 years old, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, dish towel in her hands. She'd heard everything. I waited for her to speak up, to tell her husband that he was out of line. But instead, she looked at me with that same disappointed expression I'd seen too many times lately and said, "Dad, just get him the beer. It's not worth fighting over." And right then, standing between my daughter and the man she'd chosen to marry, something inside me just went quiet. Not angry. Not hurt. Just quiet. Like a door closing on something that used to matter. I remembered Becky at 8 years old, running into my arms after school, saying "You're the best daddy in the whole world." I remembered her at 18, hugging me tight at her high school graduation, whispering "Thank you for everything, Dad. I love you." But that little girl was gone. And the woman standing in front of me had made her choice. Kyle stepped closer, so close I could smell the beer on his breath. "Here's how it's going to work, George. You live in our house. You contribute. That means when I ask you to do something, you do it. No questions. No attitude. Understand. Our house. Those two words echoed in my head. I looked at Becky one more time, giving her a chance to take it back, to remember who raised her, who sacrificed everything for her. She just stood there, arms crossed, silent. So I took a deep breath and said very quietly, "All right." Kyle's smirk got wider. "Good," he said. "Now about that beer." "I'll pack," I finished. The smirk died on his face like someone had flipped a switch. I turned and walked down that hallway, my footsteps steady on the hardwood floor that Barbara and I had refinished together 22 years ago. We'd spent 3 weeks on our hands and knees that summer, sanding and staining, laughing when Barbara hit her thumb with the hammer. Our daughter had been 8 years old then. Drawing smiley faces on the scrap wood. Now I was walking across that same floor, heading to pack a suitcase and leave the home I'd built with my own 2 hands. Behind me, I heard Becky's voice. Small and uncertain. "Dad, wait." But I kept walking. Because sometimes, the only way to teach people what they've lost is to take it away. And they were about to learn a very expensive lesson. The 30-minute drive to Pinewood Motor Lodge was the longest and shortest drive of my life. Longest because every mile felt like leaving behind everything I'd built. Shortest because the memories came flooding back so fast, I barely noticed the road. You want to know what I'd given them? Let me break it down with the kind of numbers a banker never forgets. Becky's college education. Stanford University. $175,000 over 4 years. She could have gone to Montana State on a partial scholarship. Would have cost me maybe $40,000 total. But no, she wanted Stanford, and I wanted to give my little girl the world. So I worked double shifts at the bank for 4 straight years. My hands still remember the cramps from processing loan applications until midnight. Then came the wedding. $30,000 for one day. The reception hall, the flowers, her dress, the whole 9 yards. Kyle's family couldn't afford their half. Said they'd hit hard times. So I covered it quietly, didn't want to embarrass anyone. Smiled through the whole thing while my retirement savings got smaller and smaller. But that wasn't the end. Oh no, young couples need help getting started, right? That's what I told myself when I gave them $95,000 for their down payment. $95,000. And when they couldn't make the monthly mortgage, I started paying that too. $1,400 a month. Add another $350 for utilities. Another $600 for groceries when money got tight. My Social Security check was $1,863 a month. You do the math. I was going backwards, draining my savings every single month just to keep them afloat. The Pinewood Motor Lodge wasn't much to look at. $45 a night, faded curtains, a bed that sagged in the middle. But it was mine. I spread my paperwork across that little table by the window. Bank statements going back 5 years. Receipts. Mortgage documents. Insurance policies. Everything organized, everything documented. 30 years in banking teaches you to keep records. I pulled out the photo of Barbara I kept in my wallet. Taken at Glacier National Park, 2 months before the cancer came back. She was wearing that blue sweater I loved, smiling at the camera with those eyes that saw right through me. Did I do the right thing, honey? I asked her picture. Or am I just a stubborn old fool throwing away his only daughter? That's when I opened my laptop to start organizing files, and I saw it. An old email in my backup folder. Sent from Kyle to Barbara's email address. 7 months ago. 2 months before the cancer took her. The subject line said, "Don't worry, Mrs. M." My hands shook as I opened it. "Don't worry, Mrs. M," Kyle had written. "I'll take care of Becky and the house when you're gone. I promise you won't have to worry about anything." And then Right at the end, a little winking emoji. That's when it hit me like a freight train. Kyle hadn't just taken advantage after Barbara died. He'd been planning this while she was dying. Circling like a vulture, making promises to my sick wife while already planning how to take everything. I sat back in that cheap motel chair, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This wasn't just disrespect. This wasn't just entitlement. This was premeditated. Calculated. And if Kyle had been planning to take my house for 7 months, what else had he been hiding? I needed answers. And I knew exactly who to call. Bob Sullivan had worked at First Heritage Bank for 30 years. If anyone knew the truth about Kyle Dawson's finances, it would be Bob. But what he told me the next morning made Kyle's beer demand look like nothing at all. Tuesday morning, I walked into Riverside Diner at 7 a.m. sharp, same as I'd done every week for the past 20 years. Some routines you keep because they're the only things that still make sense. When your world's falling apart. The smell of coffee and bacon hit me like a warm blanket, and for just a moment, I could pretend everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. And what I was about to learn would prove that Kyle Dawson was even worse than I'd imagined. I'd barely slid into my usual corner booth when I heard a voice from across the room. George Mitchell. Well, I'll be damned. It was Bob Sullivan. 68 years old, retired from First Heritage Bank 3 years back, and one of the few men I still trusted in this world. We'd worked together for 15 years, shared enough coffee breaks to consider ourselves friends. Bob had that newspaper folded under his arm, reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. Mind if I join you? He asked, already sliding into the seat across from me. Heard you moved out to Pinewood Lodge. Everything all right? I could have lied. Could have said everything was fine, just needed a change of scenery. But Bob had known me too long for that. Family situation, I said carefully. Needed some space to think things through. Bob nodded slowly, studying my face the way bankers do when they're trying to read between the lines. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. George, there's something you need to know. That son-in-law of yours, Kyle Dawson, he tried to pull a fast one on us about 4 months back. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. What kind of fast one? Bob's expression darkened. Home equity loan. $75,000. Walked right into my office with a stack of paperwork, claimed he owned your house on Cedar Street. The diner noise seemed to fade away. Everything went quiet except for Bob's voice and my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Kyle had tried to steal $75,000 using my house as collateral. He had documentation and everything, Bob continued. Looked official at first glance. Deed transfer papers, title documents. The whole 9 yards. But when we ran the standard title search, everything came back to you. Clean title, no cosigners, nothing that would give him any legal claim to that property. Bob paused, making sure I understood the weight of what he was saying. George, those documents weren't just mistakes. They were forged. Fake signatures, falsified notary stamps. This was deliberate fraud. When exactly did this happen? I asked, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. December 18th. Bob pulled out his phone, checking his notes. I handled the application personally. Because of the amount involved. Rejected it the same day once we confirmed the fraud. Flagged his information in our system too. December 18th. I did the math in my head. 4 months ago. Right around the time Kyle started getting more aggressive at home. More demanding. Treating me less like family and more like an obstacle. It all made sense now. He wasn't just freeloading. He was executing a plan. When the loan fraud failed, he'd switched tactics. Keep me compliant, keep me paying, keep me under control until he could find another way to take everything. Bob wasn't finished. There's more, George. Word around town is that Kyle's got gambling debts. Pretty substantial ones. You might want to talk to Detective Frank Hayes down at the police station. He mentioned something a few weeks back about Kyle being a regular at Glacier Ridge Casino. My stomach dropped. Fraud. Gambling. What else had Kyle been hiding? An hour later, I was sitting in Detective Frank Hayes' office. 55 years old, 25 years on the force, and Frank had that weathered look of a man who'd seen every kind of human weakness there was. His office was exactly what you'd expect. Filing cabinets, coffee-stained paperwork, photographs of criminals and missing persons tacked to a corkboard. Frank, I need to know the truth about Kyle Dawson. I said without preamble. Frank leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Kyle's definitely known at the casino, George. High-stakes poker tables, mostly. Been tracking his activity because some of the creditors have been calling us. Not criminal yet, but heading that direction. How much are we talking about? Between $22,000 and $25,000. Different creditors. Different payment plans, all of them going south. Frank pulled out a file folder. He's been stalling for about 6 weeks now. Most creditors give you 3 months before things escalate. Kyle's running out of time. Frank slid a photograph across the desk. Surveillance image from the casino, dated March 22. There was Kyle, clear as day, sitting at a poker table with stacks of chips in front of him. And next to him, leaning close, laughing at something he'd said, was a woman. Mid-30s, dark hair, definitely not my daughter. March 22nd, I said quietly. That was my 72nd birthday. Kyle told Becky he was working overtime that night. She made me a cake. We ate it together, just the two of us, because her husband was supposedly earning extra money for their future. I stared at that photograph, at Kyle's smiling face, at the woman who wasn't his wife, at the chips representing money he didn't have, gambled away while his pregnant wife, or so he'd later claim, waited at home. And something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about disrespect anymore. This wasn't even about money. Kyle Dawson was a fraud, a gambler, a liar. And possibly a cheat. And he'd been planning to destroy my family from the inside out. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated a 72-year-old man who'd spent 30 years in banking, who knew every legal maneuver, every financial leverage point, and who now had nothing left to lose. Kyle wanted to play games. Fine. But this was one game he was going to lose. And I was about to make my first move. Sunday morning arrived with clear Montana skies, and I woke up with the clearest head I'd had in 5 years. 30 years in banking had taught me something important. When someone tries to steal from you, you don't get mad. You don't get loud. You get methodical. And that Sunday morning, sitting at that little motel table with my laptop and phone, I became very, very methodical. I spread out my paperwork like a general planning a campaign. Bank statements, insurance policies, legal documents, everything organized, everything within reach. Then I started making calls. First call went to First Heritage Bank. Good morning, Mr. Mitchell, the automated system recognized my account. How can we help you today? I need to cancel the automatic mortgage payment for 847 Cedar Street, I said calmly. Account number ending in 4729. There was a pause. Computer keys clicking in the background. Sir, I show that payment has been active for 5 years. $1,400 monthly. Are you absolutely sure you want to discontinue it? Completely sure, I replied. The homeowners no longer qualify for my financial assistance. May I ask the reason for the change? The representative sounded concerned, probably thought I was making a mistake. My name is on the deed and the mortgage, I explained patiently. The residents were guests in my home. That arrangement has ended. More clicking. Very well, Mr. Mitchell. The automatic payment will be cancelled effective immediately. You should receive written confirmation within 3 business days. Confirmation number Delta 7943 Baker. Second call was easier. State Farm had been insuring both their vehicles on my policy for 3 years. Kyle's Silverado. Pickup, Becky's Honda Civic. $295 every month for cars I never drove, coverage for accidents I'd never cause. I need to remove 2 vehicles from my policy. I told the agent. My daughter and son-in-law will need to establish their own coverage. When would you like this change to take effect? Today, I said. Right now. The credit cards took longer. Becky was an authorized user on 3 of my accounts. Visa, MasterCard, and the Costco card. $540 monthly I'd been paying on balances I'd never created, purchases I'd never made. Mr. Mitchell, the Visa representative explained, removing authorized users will require them to apply for their own credit. Any outstanding balances will remain your responsibility. But they won't be able to make new charges. I understand, I said. Remove her immediately. I'll pay off the current balance, but no new charges. Confirmation number Echo 3611. Each call felt like lifting a weight off my shoulders. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. I called Richard Chen, the attorney who'd handled Barbara's estate. Richard, I need 3 things. Formal eviction notice for 847 Cedar Street, 30-day timeline. Change to my will, removing Rebecca as beneficiary and designating the property to Montana Veterans Housing Fund. And I want to start paperwork for a restraining order against Kyle Dawson. Richard was quiet for a moment. George, are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. By noon, I'd made 8 calls. Mortgage payment stopped. Insurance cancelled. Credit cards blocked. Automatic transfers that had been bleeding my accounts dry for 5 years, all of it ended with polite conversations and confirmation numbers. I sat back in that cheap motel chair and looked at my notes. Confirmation numbers, reference codes, effective dates. The paper trail of financial independence. My phone sat silent on the table. No missed calls. No urgent messages. They didn't know yet. Probably wouldn't know until the first payment bounced. The first bill arrived with their names on it. Instead of mine. But they would know soon enough. Wednesday brought 12 missed calls. Friday brought 28. And every single voicemail told me exactly what I needed to know. Panic had set in. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that I wasn't just cutting off their money. I was cutting off every escape route Kyle had planned. The fraud. The gambling, the lies, all of it was about to come crashing down on his head. And when they finally showed up at my motel room door on Thursday morning, desperate and angry and scared, I was ready for them. Because the old man they thought they could push around had just become their worst nightmare. Wednesday morning, my phone started ringing. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. By the end of the day, I had 12 missed calls. I listened to them in order, and let me tell you, it was like watching someone realize they'd just driven off a cliff. The first message was Becky, her voice confused but calm. Dad, hey, the bank called about the mortgage payment. They're saying there was an error with the automatic transfer. Can you give me a call when you get a chance? Thanks. She still thought it was a mistake. Still believed this was something that could be fixed with a simple phone call. Thursday brought more calls. Kyle this time, annoyed but not worried yet. George, what's going on with the mortgage payment? Bank says you canceled it. Also got a notice that our car insurance lapsed. You need to call them back and fix this. It's making us look bad. Making them look bad. That's what he was worried about. Not the consequences. Just the appearance. By Friday morning, panic had crept in. Becky again, voice cracking. Dad, what the hell is going on? The bank says you stopped the automatic payment on purpose. They want the full amount by Monday or they'll start foreclosure proceedings. $1,400, Dad. We don't have that kind of money just sitting around. Please call me back. Friday afternoon, Kyle's messages got aggressive. Clark, you need to fix this right now. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but these debt collectors are calling my work. My boss is asking questions. You're making us look like deadbeats. Call me back, old man. This isn't funny. Saturday brought desperation. Becky crying. Dad, please. I know you're upset about what happened, but we can work this out. We'll apologize. We'll make changes. Just please, don't do this. We're losing everything. And finally, Kyle trying a different approach, his voice artificially calm. George, look, maybe I came on too strong last weekend. We all said things we didn't mean. But you're talking about our home, our credit, our whole lives here. Let's talk this through like adults. I deleted every message after listening. Felt nothing but mild curiosity about their growing desperation. They still didn't understand. They thought this was about hurt feelings. About an old man throwing a tantrum. They had no idea this was about justice. Thursday morning brought a knock at my motel door. Through the peephole, I saw them both. Becky in a wrinkled sweater. Eyes red from crying. Kyle in his work clothes from Mountain Auto Sales, face flushed with barely controlled anger. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. Dad. Becky's voice was raw. We need to talk. About what? I asked calmly. About the fact that you're trying to ruin our lives over some stupid argument about beer. Kyle pushed forward, his voice rising. I'm not trying to ruin anything, I said. I'm simply no longer paying for your lives. The mortgage, George. Kyle's face was getting redder. You can't just stop paying the mortgage. That's our house. Actually, it's my house. I corrected him. My name on the deed. My signature on the loan. You two were just guests. Becky grabbed Kyle's arm as he stepped closer. Dad, please. We can work this out. Kyle was wrong to talk to you that way. We both were. But you can't just leave us with no warning, no discussion. You gave me an ultimatum, I reminded her. Do what Kyle says or get out. Those were your exact words. I didn't mean it like that. Yes, you did, I said quietly. You meant every word. You just didn't expect me to choose option 2. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photograph detective Hayes had given me. The casino surveillance photo. Before Kyle could say anything else, I handed it to Becky. Who's the woman, Kyle? I asked, my voice level. The color drained from Kyle's face. Becky looked at the photo, confused at first, then her expression changed as she recognized her husband. When was this taken? She asked slowly. March 22nd, I said. Becky's hand started shaking. That was your birthday, Dad. Kyle said he was working overtime that night. I made you a cake. We sat in the kitchen eating it while my husband was at a casino with another woman. Becky finished, her voice barely a whisper. Kyle lunged toward me, but I stepped back calmly. "I can call the police if you keep raising your voice," I said. "I have a restraining order pending. This is private property, and you're disturbing the peace." They both stared at me then. Really seeing me for the first time in years. Not the soft-hearted father and convenient bank account. Just a man who'd finally learned to say no. Kyle grabbed Becky's elbow. "Come on, we'll figure this out ourselves." But Becky pulled away from him, still staring at the photo. "Who is she, Kyle?" "Becky." "Not now." "Who is she?" "Just someone from the casino." "It doesn't mean anything." Becky's laugh was bitter. "You were with another woman on my father's birthday while I sat home alone making cake. And it doesn't mean anything." They left separately. Kyle storming to his truck, Becky walking slowly to her Honda, the photo still clutched in her hand. I watched them drive away, then closed the door and picked up my phone. Time to make sure the whole town knew the truth. Because in a small town like Kalispell, reputation is everything. And Kyle Dawson's reputation was about to become exactly what he deserved. I didn't waste time. Friday morning, I walked into the post office right at opening. Mrs. Helen Carter was behind the counter, 68 years old and the most efficient information network in Kalispell. She'd known me since Barbara and I moved to town in 1982. "George, dear," she said, concern in her voice. "I've been hearing troubling things about family troubles. Is everything all right?" I considered my response carefully. Mrs. Carter would repeat whatever I said to at least a dozen people by Sunday service. "Becky and Kyle asked me to move out of my own house," I said simply. Sometimes adult children need to learn to handle their own responsibilities without draining their father's retirement savings. Her eyebrows rose. "They asked you to leave your own house? After you paid for Becky's college and that beautiful wedding?" I nodded but didn't elaborate. The facts would speak for themselves. Next stop was Cooper's Hardware on Main Street. Sam Cooper, the owner, looked up from his inventory sheets. "George, heard you're staying at Pinewood. What's going on?" By the time I'd explained the situation, 3 other employees had gathered around. Their reactions were immediate. Shocked that Kyle had treated me so disrespectfully. Angry that I'd been supporting them financially for years without recognition. "You paid for her Stanford tuition?" Dave, the assistant manager, shook his head. "Kyle told everyone his family was well off. Said they were helping you with expenses." Kyle said a lot of things that weren't true. I replied calmly. Sam's expression darkened. That explains why he always seemed to have money but never worked overtime. Those other commitments were probably at the casino, Sarah from the paint counter muttered. But Kyle wasn't taking this quietly. Saturday morning, he launched his own campaign. Went through town spreading lies. Telling anyone who'd listen that I had dementia. That I'd abandoned them without warning, that there was a family medical emergency and I was refusing to help. Detective Hayes called me around noon. "George, Kyle was here this morning filing a complaint. Elder abuse. Claims you're being manipulated by someone at the bank to make bad financial decisions." I told him we'd need medical documentation and witness statements, which he obviously can't provide. "Just wanted to give you a heads up." 20 minutes later, Becky called. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Her voice was different. Tired. "There's no pregnancy." I lied because I was desperate. "Kyle said if I told you I was pregnant and having complications, you'd have to help us." "The doctor's appointment I mentioned?" "Never made it." "I'm sorry." I wasn't surprised. Just disappointed. "Thank you for telling me the truth, sweetheart." That afternoon, I was walking downtown when I encountered Kyle outside First Heritage Bank. He was talking loudly to a small crowd. His voice carrying that aggressive edge I'd learned to recognize. "He's lost his mind," Kyle was saying. "Senile old man thinks everyone's trying to steal from him. Kicked his own daughter out over nothing. The man needs to be in a home." I approached calmly, and the crowd noticed me before Kyle did. Faces turned in my direction, expressions shifting as they recognized the subject of Kyle's rant. Kyle spun around, his face flushing red. There he is, the man who abandoned his own family. "Hello Kyle," I kept my voice level. "How's that $25,000 in gambling debt working out?" The accusation hit him like a physical blow. Several people in the crowd murmured among themselves, pulling out phones. "You're crazy," Kyle sputtered. "I don't have any gambling debt." "Detective Hayes has surveillance photos from Glacier Ridge Casino," I said to the gathering crowd. "High-stakes poker. And Bob Sullivan at the bank has documentation of your attempted fraud. $75,000 home equity loan using forged documents on a house you don't own." Kyle's face went from red to purple. "You can't prove any of that." "I can document every dollar I've spent supporting you for 5 years," I interrupted. "Can you document where your paychecks went?" The crowd was listening intently now, recording on their phones. Kyle realized he'd lost control of the narrative. "This isn't over," he growled, pushing through the crowd. I watched him storm away, noting how several people immediately started texting. An hour later, my phone rang. Mike Patterson, Kyle's boss from Mountain Auto Sales. "George, I need to ask you something directly. Are the things Kyle's been saying about you true? That you had some kind of breakdown?" Mike's voice carried skepticism. "Thing is, I've known you 20 years. You co-signed my son's first car loan. This doesn't sound like the man I know." "Mike, Kyle gave me an ultimatum to obey his orders or leave. I chose to leave. There's no medical emergency, no breakdown. My banker, my lawyer, and Detective Hayes can all confirm my mental faculties are perfectly sound. What Kyle hasn't told you is that he owes $25,000 in gambling debts and attempted to fraudulently mortgage my house for $75,000. A long pause. "I was afraid of that," Mike said quietly. "George, I've got customers calling today who saw Kyle's behavior downtown. One recognized him from the casino. This kind of controversy, it's affecting my dealership's reputation. Customers trust us with major purchases. I can't have this. I'm going to have to let him go." By Sunday evening, 3 different debt collection agencies had visited the house on Cedar Street. Continental Credit Recovery, Frontier Financial Services, Mountain States Collections. I'd called each one Friday afternoon, giving them Kyle's correct employment information and clarifying that he had no ownership interest in my property. Diane Fletcher, my neighbor of 22 years, called that evening. "George, I hope you don't mind, but I wanted you to know there's been a lot of shouting at the house. Mostly Kyle. Police have driven by twice today. Thank you for letting me know, Diane. I appreciate you keeping an eye on things." Monday morning, the sheriff's deputy served Kyle with the restraining order. 500 feet minimum distance from me or my property. Violation meant immediate arrest. That afternoon, Earl Thompson, the Pinewood manager, knocked on my door. "Mr. Mitchell. That man who was yelling in our parking lot, he came back about 20 minutes ago. Stood outside your door for maybe 5 minutes, then left. Made some guests nervous. I've got it on security video. If you need it." I forwarded the video to Detective Hayes. Kyle had violated the restraining order within hours of being served. His desperation was making him reckless. And reckless men make mistakes. Big mistakes. The kind that have consequences they can't run from. And Kyle Dawson was about to face every single one. Tuesday morning, Becky sent me a text. He's gone. Kyle packed his truck last night and left. No note. No forwarding address. Nothing. Then another text came through. Found credit card statements he'd been hiding. The debts are worse than we thought. $38,000, Dad. I filed for divorce this morning. Sunday, I walked into St. Matthew's Lutheran Church for the first time in 2 weeks. The sanctuary was fuller than usual. Word had gotten around about some kind of announcement. When testimony time came, Becky stood from the back row. She walked down that center aisle. And I could see her hands shaking. I need to tell you all something about my father, she began, her voice carrying through the silent sanctuary. For the past 5 years, George Mitchell has been supporting my husband and me financially. $175,000 for my college. $30,000 for my wedding. $95,000 for our house down payment. Monthly mortgage. Utilities, groceries, everything. And when he wouldn't follow my husband's orders like a servant, we gave him an ultimatum. Obey or leave his own house. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Dad chose to leave rather than surrender his dignity, Becky continued, tears flowing now. I stood by and watched my husband disrespect the man who sacrificed his retirement for our comfort. I chose loyalty to a liar over loyalty to the man who raised me with love. She looked directly at me. Dad, I'm sorry isn't enough for what we put you through. But I'm hoping it's a start. Pastor John Brennan approached the podium, his own eyes wet. Sometimes the hardest courage is admitting our mistakes publicly, he said. Rebecca has shown that courage today. After the service, people approached me with embraces and words of support. But the most meaningful moment came outside when Becky walked up to me. The letter to the Kalispell Tribune runs Wednesday, she said quietly. The Facebook post goes up tonight. Full disclosure like you asked. 3 months later, I stood in the front yard of 847 Cedar Street, watching 3 veteran families move into the transitional housing units. The Montana Veterans Housing Fund had renovated the house into separate apartments. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, recently returned from deployment, was directing her 2 children toward the donated playground equipment. Mr. Mitchell, she said, shaking my hand firmly. This opportunity means everything to us. Thank you for choosing veterans. Veterans understand sacrifice, I replied. This house should serve people who've actually earned it. My own life had settled into something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I'd purchased a small cabin on Flathead Lake. With the money no longer flowing to ungrateful dependents. Morning coffee on the deck watching ospreys fish. Afternoon reading in the sun. Evening walks along the shore. Simple pleasures that felt luxurious after 5 years of financial stress and family drama. My phone buzzed with a text from Becky. Dad, I'm 3 months into counseling. Learning a lot about healthy relationships and boundaries. Could we try having coffee sometime? I'd like to earn your trust back, one conversation at a time. I looked out at the lake, watching the sunset paint the water gold and orange. Then I typed back. Coffee sounds good. Saturday morning, Riverside Diner, 7 a.m. Her response came immediately. I'll be there. And Dad, thank you for not giving up on me completely. I set the phone down and looked at Barbara's photo on the mantel. She was smiling in that blue sweater from Glacier Park, eyes full of the wisdom I still missed every day. You used to say trust is like fine china, honey, I said to her picture. Once broken, you can glue it back together, but the cracks always show. But you also believed in second chances. So we'll see. The sun dipped below the Rocky Mountains, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear children laughing at the veterans' housing complex. Families building new lives in the home where I'd learned the difference between generosity and enabling. Justice had been served. Dignity had been preserved. And maybe, just maybe, a daughter was ready to earn back her father's trust through honest effort instead of empty promises. It had been worth the wait. Every single hard decision. Every sleepless night at that motel. Every difficult conversation. Because sometimes, the greatest act of love is teaching someone the consequences of taking love for granted. And sometimes, redemption starts with two people, sitting across from each other in a diner, trying to rebuild what was broken. One cup of coffee at a time. Folks, George Mitchell's story teaches us something our generation learned the hard way but sometimes forgets. There's a difference between helping someone you love and letting them take advantage of you. Real love isn't about saying yes to everything. Sometimes, real love means saying no, it means setting boundaries. It means letting people face the consequences of their choices. Even when it breaks your heart. For 5 years, George thought he was being a good father by sacrificing everything. His retirement savings. His peace of mind. His dignity. But all he was doing was enabling his daughter and son-in-law to treat him like an ATM machine instead of a human being. The moment he walked away, the moment he took back his power, everything changed. Not immediately. Not easily. But it changed. And here's the important part. George didn't seek revenge out of spite. He sought justice through truth. He documented everything. He used legal channels. He let their own actions speak for themselves. That's how you handle betrayal with dignity. That's how you protect yourself without becoming the villain in someone else's story. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt taken for granted by family or struggled with setting boundaries, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss stories like this. Give this video a thumbs up if George's courage inspired you. And here's the big one. Drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-respect? How did you handle it? Your story might help someone else going through the same thing. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's a friend who's being taken advantage of. Maybe it's an adult child who needs to understand what their parents sacrificed. Maybe it's someone sitting in a motel room right now, wondering if they made the right choice by walking away. George's story reminds us that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. 72 years old, and he rebuilt his entire life. Found peace. Restored his dignity. And opened the door to real reconciliation, the kind built on respect instead of guilt. If he can do it, so can you. Thanks for listening, folks. I'll see you in the next story. And remember, dignity isn't something someone gives you. It's something you give yourself by knowing when to walk away.